Welcome to Technology Tangents. We get leaders together to discuss the important tech of today and the implications for tomorrow. Our discussions are fun, lighthearted, and frankly opinionated, but hopefully gives you a sense of what matters, what to pay attention to, and what to ignore. Hot off the press, cybersecurity is a big deal. To talk about that, as always, Jason Goth. How are you, Jason?
Hey, Vincent. It's weird to be in here on a Tuesday morning.
Yeah, a little bit different. I have a little trip coming up, so thanks for being flexible. Appreciate that. And same to you, Kevin. You're hot off a jet from Colorado, right?
Colorado, yeah.
How was that?
It was great.
Yeah?
I wish I would still be there.
Okay, fair enough. Well, next time maybe we need to do some destination podcasts.
Oh, I like that.
Sort of like the All-In Summit. We'll do the Tech Tangent Summit in a beautiful place that people pay. Probably don't. We'd have to pay them to come, probably, but it's aspirational. We'll keep it aspirational.
As long as Credera pays for us to go, I don't care.
It doesn't matter. The rest doesn't matter. Yeah, that's
Jason's
funny.
boat on some random lakes across the country. I like that.
Yeah, that'll work.
Let's do it.
Okay, done.
Sponsored
It's happening. You heard it here
Wet
first.
Bass Fishers.
Yeah, is there a sponsor, some kind of bass boat sponsor we need to get in here, Jason?
Oh, yeah. There's
a few.
See if we can do that.
Okay, we'll look into that. All right, very good. No, but seriously, I do want to talk about cybersecurity. So this, of course, is an area that's always been interesting. It's always been a topic ever since cloud that I'm aware of, and before that, I'm sure it was still an issue. IDC recently said that it's really going to continue growing at double-digit rates. 2023 to 28, they're expecting it to be about a $201 million in 2028. That's roughly, a 24% CAGR. Bank of America expects this category to grow from about $7.2 billion today to $16 billion in 2027. We juxtapose that, though, with Kaspersky. Is that how you say it, Jason? Kaspersky? Kaspersky Labs getting booted via Biden from the U.S. They're winding down all their operations in the U.S. From July 20th. There's nothing to be done. Any consumer who has that software, nothing to purchase, not available for purchase in the U.S. So it seems like everything is going the opposite way, if you look at that as an example, until you get to the point that, Google just announced Wiz. Am I saying it right, Jason? Wiz?
Wiz.
Yeah. Okay. There's no age. I wasn't positive.
WIZ is pretty...
Well, there was no age. I don't know. Maybe, and I don't know. There could be things going on.
Maybe it's Wise.
Wise? No, I think it's Wiz. I think you're right. I just want to make
Woz.
sure.
I thought that was what it was. But
Woz. Nice. Woz is actually part of the Wiz deal. Yeah, no. So they're of course a new-ish startup. Their valuation is soared to the levels that only AI companies have been getting in the recent past. It was founded in 2020 by some Israeli folks whose names I will not even pretend to pronounce correctly. Not their first startup, by the way. Actually, their last startup was acquired by Microsoft in 2013 or something. But this year, they had raised about $1 billion at a valuation of $12 billion. So 12x multiple in obviously late stage funding, but only 5 years in. So not that late stage, pretty significant. And it would be Google's largest acquisition ever. So I don't know if you guys know, but Google historically does not buy big companies. It's not a part of their M&A strategy. So, it's 4x the size of Nest. If you want to put it in perspective, that's a huge, huge valuation. So why this, Jason? What's going on? On one hand, we have Russia getting kicked out in cybersecurity. On the other hand, we have Google buying a massive Israeli-U.S. firm.
Well, I think cybersecurity is a huge topic, and there's no shortage of breaches. We can talk about any of the recent ones, AT&T, Disney, there seems to be a new one every week, and a lot of ransomware attacks, a lot of breaches. And, it's funny to me because they seem to be coming from a lot of different sources. Mm-hmm. So, not small individuals, looking for fame or free phone calls, but, large criminal organization, nation states, but you now got these hacktivist groups, right? That like who was it? Disney. They were hacked, and they got like 1 terabyte of internal Slack and emails and other correspondence. And
just so, since you're bringing it up, I didn't get to it yet for the setup, but hackers, claim to have leaked roughly 1.1 terabytes of Disney Slack messages.
Yeah.
So the internal platform where lots of companies talk, Disney's on that platform. They got all of the messages and all of the files from nearly 10,000 channels. A huge leak of, probably a lot of nonsense about status updates and who cares, but also architectural diagrams likely, internal memos, sort of issues, strategies, issues, vulnerabilities, things of this nature, but could lead to
potential
more.
show ideas, all kinds of, trade secrets. But, there's an argument, not an argument, a conspiracy, or even maybe not a conspiracy theory, but a rumor that it was an inside job. Someone unhappy with Disney did that, but who knows? But it doesn't really matter. The group that did it, right? What I was getting at is they're this hacktivist group, and they're only going after companies that commit what they call 3 great sins, right? One is any funding or use of crypto, like they're very anti-cryptocurrency for some reason. No AI generated art, right? Or any theft from Patreon or other art platforms. And so if you don't do those things, you're fine. But if you do those things, then they're going to go after you. And so my point was, like, there's all these now hacktivist groups, and it doesn't really matter what you do. You're going to run afoul of some of them, right? And so you've got just the whole proliferation of people, looking for, to hack. And, now that there's a lot of tools out there, AI specifically, to help do this. And so that
would be pretty ironic, by the way, if this hacktivist group that is anti-AI in the context, at least of artists, was then using it to write software themselves. That's kind of ironic.
Or what do we think they're using to go through 1 terabyte worth of Disney internal messages?
Yeah, exactly. They're definitely using AI and ML there. They have to be. Although not maybe collecting money, because they don't accept crypto. So
but they're not generating art. So
right.
They just want free passes for Genie Pass, because it may be worth more than crypto.
Excellent. You can pay us
Genie Pass passes. Yeah.
That's awesome.
You guys have been to Disney much more recently.
We have young kids. Yes.
Yeah.
My last trip to Disney World was just that, my last. But my kids, but
grandkids are coming.
Yeah, that's true.
Coming
that's
up,
true.
Yep. Grandpa.
I'm gonna let Rachel and the girls take them to Disney World, but
it's a grandma trip.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I got you off track.
No, that's fine.
So there are 3 tenets they won't do, to your point.
But my point is, like, that hacktivist group, but there's all kinds of hacktivist groups that go after you, whether it's, the more climate focused ones that went after, like, the Colonial Pipeline. Some, a lot of them are just criminal organizations looking to hold people ransom. But the number and size and complexity of the hacking organizations is growing exponentially. Their capabilities are growing exponentially because of AI and other things. There's other reasons why I think this is happening. We can get into those, but there's applications are much more complex. We're using lots of cloud and security. Not that cloud and SaaS are inherently insecure, but they do have this idea of shared responsibility. That there's some things they provide, but there's some things you've got to provide, and no one really understands, like, where the exact lines of that shared responsibility are. That's something that we actually help people do. But you've got all of these applications that are much more distributed, much more complex, many more. It's like if you look at old car engines, right? You look at old car engines from like a pickup truck in the 50s, and you could get in there and stand around that thing, right? It's there's 10 parts, and look into a modern car engine, there's a million parts, and which one could go wrong, which one, anything. So
sure.
The applications have gotten so big, so complex, with hundreds of components, much more distributed. It's just harder to find all of those things, and then you distribute that responsibility. Some we're responsible for, some, the cloud vendors are responsible for, and, we hire a lot of other third-party consultants and other people that are responsible for other pieces of it. So, it's inevitable that things are going to get missed. So you have
that
more,
software
more
supply
surface
chain
area
effectively becomes really complex.
Yeah.
And each one of those steps in that supply chain is potentially vulnerable.
Right.
And could compromise the entire system. Like we saw back in the day with Target, right? That was 2013 or something. We saw that a sort of precursor to their vendor management system got hacked. And as a result, they ended up being infiltrated and, cost them millions of dollars and $20 million fine or something. It was actually quite small for the amount of breach that was, but it was also 2013. So, yeah, how do you address that? I mean, what are people supposed to do?
Well, that's, again, you've got a much larger attack surface and many more people with more sophisticated tools coming after it. And that's why you see all of these things. And that, you're back to like why the first question we were answering was why would Google be willing to pay, roughly a 45 or 50x, multiple on revenue for a security firm. And, I think that's why, they're lagging in cloud sales, and this is a real, I think, differentiator. It is a really good product. If you looked at it, it can really help, that with all of those complex pieces, find, all of the places where things might not be, completely locked down, all the open windows and stuff in the house. And there are other tools that do it too. It's not just them, but it is, I think, a good product. But and so that having those capabilities, essentially, built into the platform is a real differentiator. And so, as more and more people like, AT&T, right? They just announced a huge breach, which was something like every phone record prior to 2019 or something like that. And there's a dozen class action lawsuits. Like, how much is that going to cost? Forget regulatory and legal fines and the recovery, and brand damage and all that. Just the lawsuits, right? To settle, it's going to be a very large number.
Yeah, I mean, just to that point. So AT&T was they announced they just discovered they had been hacked. The hack actually took place months ago. April is their best guess currently. And this, by the way, is not to be confused with the 2021 hack, where, again, they lost millions of records at that moment in time as well. But this one is 110 million users. It is effectively a full infiltration of all of that data, meaning everybody you called, everybody you texted, everybody you communicated with, every place you were, and every time your phone was connected to the cell tower is all captured. All that data is known, all of that metadata. Now, not the conversations themselves, not the text messages themselves, but all of the metadata surrounding that. And what's so fascinating about this, back to your point of that sort of supply chain, the actual hack was not AT&T infrastructure exactly, not directly at least. It was actually an infiltration of Snowflake. Yeah. And so
I wasn't going to name the name. I was going to say a cloud provider, but a cloud data provider.
It is what it is. Yeah. I mean, look, the headline of that is that lots of people store their data in these sort of third-party tools, in this case Snowflake. It's generally a good tool, but they exfiltrated exabytes of data. I mean, just think about all of the data for 110 million people, all that metadata, it's exabytes of data, no doubt. And in essence, what I found, again, I don't know who this guy is exactly, but from Scott Schober, a cybersecurity guy, he said that it was actually a stolen login credential, and then it was a lack of MFA. And so because they didn't have multi-factor authentication implemented, the person just stole the credentials or hacked the credentials or guessed the credentials or social engineered the credentials, however that happened. Mm-hmm. And they were able to exfiltrate all of that data and nobody was the wiser, which sounds insane. I mean, how do you not have some IT policy that says, hey, if somebody's downloading even a petabyte, let alone exabyte of data, probably we should probably alert on that and maybe stop. That's the kind of thing that just seems crazy.
And that's why it's, the modern applications are, to use the house analogy, they're houses with 10,000 windows, right? And one gets left unlocked. Actually, Snowflake is actually a Wiz customer.
Oh, interesting.
Right. I don't know to what extent they've implemented it or what components, but, I think in that instance, it may not even have been helpful if they actually had a credential and just had intentionally not turned on. And that's my point. Is like these things are getting so big and so complex with so many moving parts and so many different vendors, both hosting and externally, that, that's why these tools, like Wiz, they, Google also bought another tool, called Mandiant not long ago, which that was the tool that found the original SolarWinds, right, hack. And so I think it's just going to continue to need to be a much bigger and bigger focus. Now, like what you asked the other question, like, what do we do about it? Right. Which is, I think, the real question. And, there's, I think, a lot of things that need to be done. Like, what doesn't need to be done is put like super restrictive top-down governance processes, right? And not that we shouldn't have governance, but like this idea that, a governance board is going to solve it is, kind of insane to me. I say this all the time. I can make any website 100% secure by unplugging it from the internet.
Sure.
And so, but
air gap, problem solved.
But then, okay, well, that's not useful, right?
What's your favorite ship quote? Ship in harbor.
Ships are safest in harbor, but that's not what they're for.
Right.
Yep. So, if not that, and I'm not against governance. Don't hear me say we need to have good security governance. But if the governance is like just a whole bunch of rules and they go around telling everybody, no, you can't plug that, you can't do that, can't do that, can't do that, can't do that. Well, then how do you run and grow your business, right? There has to be some trade-offs there. And so, what do you do? I think,
at the core of it, I guess that one of the questions that I have is, do you have to simplify that supply chain? Or how do you balance the simplification with the degradation and functionality or the extra cost that you'll have to innovate? How do you find that balance? And I'll kick it over to you in a second, Kevin, around that same idea is like, how do you really strategically, corporately, how do you think about the balance of that risk? Because again, all businesses incur risk. We understand that. You have to balance the business with the business sort of value. And I don't know, from an IT standpoint or from an infrastructure security and technology standpoint, is there a good answer here?
Well, yeah, simplification is, always a good thing to do in software, no matter what.
But is it worth it if that means you lose functionality? The cost to build something is significantly more. Again, Snowflake is not particularly special insofar as it has amazing whatever that you couldn't build yourself with enough time, money, and effort. You could, but that's a huge amount of time, money, and effort, and probably a team that you don't even have today. So it makes sense to use it in absence of risk. But when you think about it adds more complexity. How do you evaluate that?
Well, I think that is more of a shared responsibility problem. Like when you have one vendor in charge of something, who knows, like in this case, if, was it even something that Snowflake did, or is it was something on the AT&T responsibility side? And that's why you have to like define, like you look at this.
I wasn't saying it was like Snowflake's fault. I guess what I'm saying is like, if we're saying, look, Snowflake has some cool technology. In this case, again, it wasn't Snowflake fundamentally being insecure. It was the fact that it didn't implement MFA and somebody's password got stolen. So I don't think Snowflake is at fault here, which is why I don't mind mentioning them. My question, though, is from an IT lens, if from a business lens, we say, hey, we need to go build this database to store all this data so we can do analysis, reporting, and query all that metadata. Okay, that makes sense. You have a couple of options. You can go with a proprietary sort of specialized tool like Snowflake that makes that relatively easy and fast, or you could use just base cloud native software solutions that may not be quite as fast or bespoke for your purpose, but they'll work. Yeah, how do you find that trade-off?
What I'm saying is I don't think either one of those is inherently more or less secure.
Okay.
Right? What I'm getting at is like you have to invest in kind of, certainly people will mention tools like Wiz, and you do need to have those, but they're part of a larger strategy, which is like a whole people, process, technology thing. The three things we always talk about is like there have to be, we start with like, typically what we do is like start with like a threat modeling, like for what we're going to build, what are all the things that, could, how likely would it be what are all the different ways someone can interact? How likely would that be? And what would that cost to clean up, right? In terms of reputation and so what's the downside and the likelihood of that downside? for each of these, however many, hundreds of different threat, vectors there would be. And then, we look at like, okay, well, what are the right set of controls, right? And that's where you have to do some judgment there on the analysis to say, all right, well, there's nothing we can, we can fix that. We can fix that. We can fix that. We can put these controls in, these controls. We can't fix that. Like there's just nothing we can do about, this. Like maybe we can, mitigate it somehow using these controls or those controls. And then, those become the policies, and the governance is just making sure that everyone follows those. Mm-hmm. Right. And that is a whole people and process issue. Right. And that list is incredibly long because it's things in the development cycle, the software supply chain, it's things around the deployment, it's things around, customer service, it's things around like just MFA of your own devices. It's an incredibly long list, and it requires really every group, every department to take some action responsibility. And I would just say, like, I've yet to see a customer that wants to pay for all that. Right. I've yet to see anybody that wants to spend 40% of their technology budget making things as secure as they can.
Yeah.
Right. And so that is, to me, like, you've got to, make it a priority. You got to make all of those things a priority and spend the money to do them. And, balance, you're going to have to make a judgment call, a balance of like, do we get a little bit more secure in these areas, or do we get this innovation? And you're going to have to live with that. Like, the one thing everyone needs to do, look, I think everyone will get hacked. You can't, there is no way to stop it. If someone wants to get in bad enough, no matter how much you spend, they will get in. Mm-hmm. So what you need is like really robust, like encryption at rest to make sure that and isolation of things so that, that minimizes it when they get in. And you need really robust DR. Mm-hmm. Right. And again, everyone loves the idea of DR. No one wants to spend the money on DR.
Sure.
Right.
I'm going to go back to that.
It's like I've got a little extra money. Do I go fix the broken thing in the backyard, or do I take my wife to dinner? Everybody wants to go to dinner. Nobody wants to fix the broken thing, but you have to do it. I also think the government has a role here, right? And this is more Kevin, get into Kevin's area, but I mean, these guys are essentially pirates, right? And who addresses that. I think that these agencies are going to have to really beef up. And I do think that this is a policy issue that the government needs to take on from and I know we try not to get into politics here, but, I do think the agencies have to recognize, all the appropriate agencies, whether that be state, local, federal, have to recognize that, these cyber attacks are a real threat, and put the appropriate resources into detection and investigation and prosecution. Right. So that's my thought on what you do about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's good. I'm going to go back to this idea that there's two things I'm going to pick up on. The first one is, you said, look, from your standpoint, neither Snowflake or cloud native services are intrinsically more or less secure. In isolation, I can kind of see where you're getting at from that standpoint.
Well, more or less secure than what?
Right. Well, this is my point. Is like,
then you doing it yourself. Like, sure. Microsoft spent $1 billion on security. Okay. Like, we've got some customers that still like to do their own hosting, and I'm like, are you spending $5 billion on security?
I totally agree with that. No, my point is, like, if we assume that the more complex the system gets, the more vectors and larger surface that people can attack is. And then we further say that adding yet another vendor to an ecosystem increases complexity, then it must follow that a new vendor, therefore Snowflake in this case, to a cloud platform is intrinsically less secure. I mean, that's like law of transitivity, if you like, right?
No,
you can disagree with. You can
disagree with that.
Why? Tell me more. And that's the part I want to dig into. Is like, how do I balance from a risk standpoint the idea of using a vendor that's built me a specialized solution? And the reason I want to get into this so much because I think the same thing will be true for AI, as it plays out. This is going to be, I think, the new big area. But
he's always got to turn it back to AI. But
of course I do. Yeah. Of course I do. It's the only thing I know. Come on, help me out.
But look, you're the admin of the data warehouse. You've got a user and password to, for Snowflake that gets leaked and is unprotected. Sure. Or you've got a user password to some cloud native other existing AWS or Google platform that gets leaked or
yes,
that it doesn't matter where.
Yeah, I agree. And that's why I say in isolation, they're equivalent. The difference in my mind is that, to your point of governance and sort of having the manpower and the budget to go secure these environments, my guess is that there is more appetite and more budget allocated to the cloud provider as a whole than there is for a one-off vendor. Meaning that in this case, I suspect I'm sure that AT&T has an MFA policy, and I'm sure the policy is always use MFA. Now, in this particular case, they didn't for whatever reason, neither here nor there, but I bet for their cloud instance, MFA is turned on. And this is my point. As you add complexity, there are just more things you have to go and check. More integration points, more proxies, more logins, more credentials, more. And that to me seems like it's just more effort then to actually go monitor the compliance with the policies that you've written. Because again, MFA is not special. It's pretty standard in virtually every policy I've ever seen. Every company I've worked at certainly implements it. Some are more robust than others, but just turning it on seems like a good thing. And I suspect everybody would agree. In this case, allegedly, again, hard to say, according to one person, it wasn't. So again, whether it was true or not, my point is things like that are bound to happen as this gets more complex. And so limiting it seems generally good, but you lose functionality, and that's the tension that...
I hear what you're saying. I don't agree that it's more likely to happen with two vendors than one vendor.
Interesting. Why is that though? To your point, nobody wants to spend the money.
They're different groups that are set up in different accounts. They're set up with different policies, right? Things are all distributed. Maybe that's true, right? And I always say you don't want to, but you want to get to the minimum number of solutions that'll achieve your business goals, right? You don't want to, but that's not one.
Sure.
Right. And it's not unreasonable to think, millions or hundreds of thousands of companies use Snowflake it's not unreasonable to say that that's a good solution for a data warehouse, or a data analysis perspective. So,
for sure it's good.
Yeah.
But
I understand. I see your point. We need to simplify things, but, and I agree that simplification would be a good thing. It makes, less holes, but the answer isn't one.
Agreed. No, I agree. And that's where this is the question. What's the litmus test for I have too many? I come to you all the time with, hey, Jason, wouldn't this cool tool be cool? We need to use this one. Or, hey, Jason, we should try this one out. Or, hey, Jason, we should. Yeah. A lot of times you're no, that's not really needed. We can kind of do it with this. It's not quite as good, but it's, 80%. And for all the good other reasons, we should just simplify and keep it simple. And I generally agree, but how do organizations know that hey, we probably have too many here? This. And again, I think I'm pushing on this one in particular because again, I think the AI tool space is going to explode. If it hasn't already in your company, it's coming, where people are using everything under the sun. Some of those are good. Some of them are amazing for the business and terrible from a security, privacy, and even governance compliance standpoint. Some are totally fine across the board on all those fronts. Each part of the business will inevitably adopt some different subset, and we have to simplify that eventually. Not now, but eventually. And I'm trying to figure how do you think about that?
Well, I would say, my answer is how does a company know that they have too many? The answer to that is a flow chart that starts with yes, right? And right, everyone has too many.
Okay.
Right. There's always, you can always make things more efficient and get the same thing with less. But, what are you optimizing for? Most of the time you're optimizing for speed to market. And so, look, every customer I have or work with, directly is building some things that is adding new components and new software and new complexity to, no one is focusing on the opposite. like, how do we take what we have today and radically simplify and make it much more efficient and get, all the fat out of the system and, run as efficiently and securely as we can. No one is doing that, right? They're like, I need something. I need more of this and more of that. Kevin, you're responsible for this. Vincent, you're responsible for that. Y'all go and figure it out, right? And y'all don't talk to each other. You're like, hey, coordination costs skill. I got to go do it. And that's why I keep saying, like, you think about, like, what are the potential threats and what are the right things to put in place for that. And you just have to give those, enable the various parts of the business, think of it as governance as enablement, like enable people to go do it securely and address all of those concerns. Like, so for example, NFA, like, you can build a single sign-on, something like Okta single sign-on that handles all the MFA and handles all that, and say, look, everybody's got to use it, like, no matter what you implement. Mm-hmm. Like, okay, you want to go use that tool? Great. Plug it into Okta, and then that's taken care of, right? And so there's ways to understand those things and build, platform solutions, controls or whatever that then can be adopted by others and get. I think that's gives you the best balance of growth versus, governance or efficiency.
I have one really more provocative question.
Kevin's like, Kevin,
what am I here to talk about? Get in. He's out. Here's my provocative question. Last one for you. So to the point, you said, look, you believe that we're in a basically assume that you're in a post-hacked world. That is, there's no way to prevent your organization from being hacked, assuming that two things are true. One, through advanced persistent attacks and threats, they will eventually get in if they're persistent and try hard enough. There's enough people out there that there's just no preventing it. And two, that you're inevitably going to make somebody upset. And with all these hacktivist groups, they become you're effectively your APT, right? So my question is, like, is the flip something like, why waste my time on any of this? Meaning I can't prevent it. So actually I'm just going to optimize for speed and growth and not care, because they're going to get in if they want to. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I can name two companies that I won't name that are teetering on the edge of bankruptcy because they've been, hacked and are have ransomware and are just essentially shut down, doing
right.
all business paper and
right.
They don't know what they're going to do about it. And these are not small companies, right? Sure. These are larger organizations. And so you have to have some, you can't just leave all the doors and windows open with a sign out front, say, come on in, and expect, things not to go badly. You have to make some attempt. And that's why I keep, we talk about governance in terms of enablement around, like, how do we put things in place, automated, that are easy, like make it easy for all the different groups that are going to do things, I won't say right, but do things well, right? Like close all the really, really obvious ones and send many of the non-obvious ones, and then maybe have different levels of controls, like, for really like healthcare data and others, and make it easy for the different, units to adopt those controls or work with vendors who can adopt those things, is, I think, how you've got to balance it.
So basically you're saying, look, anybody can get into your house, just make sure it's slightly harder to get into your house than the neighbor's house.
Well,
you have a gun safe.
No.
Yeah, not about the gun, but actually right. You're saying, yeah, you can get in my house, but what's really protected is down there, and you're trying to work through that, because it's, that would be a different way to start thinking about you protect everything.
Well, I think about it in terms of how much is it going to cost you to get what in terms of value. Like I can make it, a certain bar to get in, it costs you $500 to get in, and you get a $400 TV. No one's going to do that.
Sure.
Right. And
to your point, just
make it more expensive.
The asymmetry, which is to say, remove the script kiddies, remove the very obvious known vulnerabilities, ensure that your passwords are not easily guessable, all of those things. And then the cost to get into your system becomes high enough that it deters most who are just looking to make a quick buck.
Right. Well, but you do have some data, healthcare data, for example, where you'd have to make that. What is the value of the data? You have to make the cost to get it much higher than the value, and then it's not worth it to people. Now, I like Kevin's analogy of the gun safe, because there's some stuff we got to really, really, really lock up, but there's no one size solution fits all for these things, right? You've got to really look at that's what we call threat modeling. What is it we're protecting, and who wants it, and how likely are they to get it, and what are the different ways, vectors, right, to get at it, and then what are the right things we need to put in place for that thing. That answer, and this is where I see governments go wrong, is when you try to make that answer for the most secure thing in our nuclear secrets of our company, and then hold everyone to that standard. That is not cost effective nor innovation effective, right? And so, you may have to have there's the gun safe, there's the stuff we keep in the locked pantry at the VRBO, and then there's everything else, whatever those things are, and you enforce those controls on the various different groups of what, depending on what they're doing.
Yeah,
Zach Vinduska, who's our CISO, is probably listening to this, right? Just throwing up in his trash can right now.
Yeah, good.
With my very rudimentary explanation.
I think it's good. I think that the complication there is the hacktivist point, which is the asymmetry of cost and value doesn't really work in that context, because they're just. Look, they could have, this example of Disney, they could have sold that data. They chose not to. They just chose to release it for the sake of releasing it. They're just trying to cause damage. Yeah. They're vandals. They're not criminals. They're just vandals. And so I think it's a very different proposition. And it does get to your point of policy, which I think we should circle back on in a second. But Kevin, what are your thoughts?
It's been fun to listen to this conversation and just to think through it. I go a couple different areas. One I'm thinking about this. What is the responsibility of a company? Mm-hmm. And Jason, I'd be consistent with you around what's the technology problem? What's really an insurance related, and then what's the business and process, and how do every companies think about that, which then leads me down to a path of cybersecurity. Coming from a business perspective, I'd historically have viewed that as insurance or as a preventative maintenance. And then I'm curious now, how much is it preventative? How much of it starts to become more competitive advantage? And how do you start thinking about that? And then my last spot, and I can dive deeper into some of these things if they're interesting, is you're really thinking about the public good and going back to the question of governance and how that plays out. And we tend to go to regulation, but I'm actually curious if maybe an area where public good would be helpful is, do we limit some of the externalities of a data breach, meaning that, hey, we're going to reduce some of the legal peril, some of the class action lawsuits, and hey, we can't solve, so that's not actually getting to the cost of how do we stop a cybersecurity or hack, but at least we're going to make it so, hey, knows that, hey, that Disney breach occurred, someone's going to pick that up and they're going to sue Disney and they're going to try to work through that. And that doesn't give the organizations a free pass, but we start to actually try to limit some of that.
The Good Samaritan laws for CPR kind of thing.
Yeah. It's we talked at the start of this discussion around, I came back from Colorado last night. We go through our mail. We don't receive much mail. We typically but one thing is almost every week we receive some notice of a breach. So last night, both my wife and I got notice of a Ticketmaster breach. And it's and I can't remember the last time I bought a ticket on Ticketmaster. And so I bring that up not to knock the company or the people that sent that, but really it becomes so numb to these elements of that. I think we're getting notified on a daily basis as an individual, and even how do we work through that? And why is companies doing that? What do the company expect me to do? Going back to how many different times has AT&T had a breach? How many different configurations of AT&T? Going back to the discussion of one versus many. Well, what is an entity anymore? And how that plays out underneath what can one company produce? So, going back then to put my business lens on, I guess the question I'm asking myself now is, how much is this insurance? And how much do I spend in that? And I think about this as that type of a risk. And then based on my answer to that, what do I try to fix and solve, which then goes back to the innovation and growth question, which we were discussing. And really, it's a trade-off decision. And I do think there's some public good things that could help in the trade-off decision, because I don't think we can actually make ourselves completely secure. I don't also think that, slowing up growth or, context of like, I'm not saying that the FCC is slowing up mergers because of this, but like, if you go back to the single entity theory, like that could be part of that rationale. And I actually think that's false sense of security. And then my last rambling thought is more personal, not too much to me, but to a family member who works for a nonprofit health organization who hasn't been able to have their systems work for the last 90 days because they got hacked and have chosen not to pay the ransom. And this is impacting, the poorest of our society, their clients, of how they grew up. And I'm like, well, that doesn't seem right either. And what do we do about that? So I think we talk about a lot of the activist stuff goes into things around the environment or cryptocurrency, but I think there's actually a lot of groups that are also just taking advantage of organizations that maybe don't have everything they needed to protect themselves or what they thought. And so I don't know what so this starts to become a public good issue. And I don't know and I wrestle with that to what is the degree. Yeah. Does it start to become like, is it insurance like hurricane insurance, or is it like insurance like we have a fire department and do we pay for that public good to help with the fire? I don't know where this goes, but it seems like it's going to have to go somewhere in between those two extremes.
I do think that, for smaller companies, like especially nonprofits, well, there are different classes. We've been, we generally talk on here around enterprises because that's who we consult for, and who listens. I think government utilities, that's probably different. There's a national security issue there, and that's probably a different answer. It's much more, I think, a national security government function. It is interesting, like, nonprofits and some of those things where, they aren't as mature and don't have the budgets. Right, that's a really, difficult position. And again, that's where I think, I think prosecution is going to have to really, or an investigation, that kind of government role is going to have to really, really step up from that.
But does that solve anything realistically? I mean, we know a lot of these actors are in other countries. We'll just leave it at that, right? They're in other countries. And so, to some degree, we've had mixed success for big enough data breaches where governments collaborate, and years down the road, they're eventually able to take people down and prosecute them. But even then, it's, individuals. It's usually not the entire organization, and people get trained across
what's the alternative? Don't. Right.
I mean, this is the really difficult part, I think. And, there's a series of good books that are on this topic about from a policy standpoint. And, Microsoft really tried to lead that charge, I don't know, almost 10 years ago. Now they really started this effort of how do we collaborate globally and what does that look like? I would say that part of the fine point to your part, the fines I think were meant to change the calculus you said earlier, Jason, which is to say every part of the business, like I have this small amount of dollars, I can allocate it to go, do some more security stuff, or I can build my new feature that I really kind of want. Well, that calculus changes dramatically in expected value if there's a massive fine sitting on the other side of it. I bet like GDPR did with data privacy, at least in the EU, where that's going to be a massive penalty if you don't comply with all of those rules and regulations. And similarly, to your point, likely there should be some rules around how long people can retain your data. So that if you even bought a ticket, on whatever website or every product and a decade, like, good grief, why do you still have my data? Like, please just purge that as a matter of business process.
I do think, though, it's a little bit like, I'll use the example of, shoplifting. You see this a lot in the news on, in some of the, West Coast, like shoplifting, right, is, people are going in, stealing lots of stuff. It's hard to run a CVS or whatever because there's so much shoplifting. Mm-hmm. And, a lot of like the regulations are essentially the analogy of like, okay, well, we're going to fine the hell out of CVS if they don't put better locks on the doors, right? Like, I don't know that is helpful, to Kevin's point about public good. I don't know if it's helpful to punish the victim, right, for not, not doing more, right?
Yeah.
They're punished the victim for not doing more. Now you say, well, they're not
no, they are.
There's
they
negligence, right?
That's right. And I think that's the part that these regulations have to address, which is that you need to meet some minimum bar of reasonable security and privacy, right? Right to the point, like, look, if I'm gonna work for this company, or if I'm gonna subscribe to their services, I should have some reasonable expectation as a consumer that they've met some minimum bar of just best practices. They're not just like taking my data, storing it in clear text, and encrypting their admin password with password.
Yeah.
Like those things, I think those things.
Should you like? Is that it? You know, if I take my car to a sketchy auto shop, do I have a expectation they're going to do as good a job as someone else? No. I mean, I as a consumer have to be somewhat informed of that. I can't just, I don't think policy can force companies to be, meet every customer expectation. Right. And I do think there's minimum levels. I'm not saying that, there's regulations that you need. I'm just saying that, like, I think more regulation doesn't help. More, investigation, enforcement does help. But I would also say there's one other thing which you kind of alluded to, which is it could be that one of the ways you could do this as a company is stop collecting data.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, everyone is we want to collect all this data. Like, well, just don't. I mean, Apple is an example of someone who will they're pretty successful, and like they won't collect anything on you.
Yeah, it's been a major differentiator for their company strategically and from a consumer value prop.
Yeah.
Right, which is say like,
and that's a hard thing for companies because they get especially execs at companies get told data is the new oil. It's the most valuable thing. You got to collect data, and maybe there is a way to do that without collecting personal data that could do you really need someone's social security number, right?
Yep. Well, I mean, you go to the doctor office, right? This is an example that's recently changed. I've noticed. I always threw a fit when the doctor wanted my social security number, and
they write it down on a sticky note and stick it in a file.
I threw a fit. Never would do it. Most people would just begrudgingly tolerate me not telling them. But recently, I've noticed they don't even ask anymore. I went to a brand new doctor just recently, and like nowhere on that form that's for social security number, and I was like, huh. Okay, yeah, good. You're collecting the minimum set of data that you actually need to run your business and not making a bigger target on your own back, which I think is smart and good.
Because they had a retinal scan when you walked in, it's all back. Exactly. Epic controls all that data. They already had it before you said it.
They went to his other doctor's office and stole it.
But this is so to that point, this is actually the last thing I wanted to bring up, which is there's this really interesting knock-on effect, the second order effect that, back to the numbness. We just all feel numb from all of our stuff being stolen and out there anyway. All of this data, so we just take the AT&T as an example, all this metadata about where you were, what stores you were at, what you were looking at ahead of time, who you called, etc., is all now available. Actually, by the way, the article just came out. They just paid $400,000, $370,000 to have them allegedly delete all the data. So maybe it's not anymore, but there's a chance it was all out there. We'll just say that. It was all out there at one point.
I might call that a down payment.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, really? That's all? Okay.
Good. Exactly. Yeah. Now here's the really interesting thing, and the second effect of that is we all become numb, no doubt. What happens to all of those data brokers? In other words, we've basically just removed the middleman. So the dirty little secret across marketing world is that actually that exact thing is happening to all of us all of the time in a legal and compliant way. That's not being stolen, it's actually being sold. Right? So these companies like CoreLogic and Epsilon and Axiom, Experian, et cetera, are literally going around to all these companies and buying exactly all that metadata. Well, where were they? What did they look at? Who are they talking to? What kind of car do they have? Where do they live? All that data is being bought and traded and sold, then used by other companies. I wonder what the long-term impacts of these kinds of incidents are on that data broker market. Does it accelerate their efforts? Does it actually degrade the offerings they have because all the data is already available just publicly? Do we end up getting so frustrated with becoming numb to this that we start demanding increasing privacy regulations and data control policies of only collecting exactly what you need to run your business and deleting it after some amount of time et cetera. I don't know. You guys have any thoughts on that?
Maybe a build, less than a thought, but I think we've had this theme before in here. We talk about just watching what Google, Amazon, the aggregators of the cloud, data, maybe AI, all these different tools. Does it really become where there's going to be really just 2 or 3 big providers that are in control most of that stuff? So maybe your question around those data aggregators, do they exist anymore? Or those just become core products of those 2 or 3, and then I don't know, ultimately, does that become, do you have an Apple or do you have an Android? I don't know if it becomes that way, that bifurcated, but potentially it does. Yeah. It's interesting right now, the risk profile, going all the way back to the start of this conversation around what was the motivation for Google to buy this company, how much of that was product revenue, how much of that was internal usage, how much of that was the protection, how much of that was creating a moat that they maybe has half, whatever, some split between internal protection versus really trying to do customer protection for their own usage. But I think it is. And then the lurking element for me back is like, well, how long before the government just essentially nationalizes that? And again, it's a theme that I don't want to go back to, but it seems like at the end of the day, that's ultimately where some of this potentially has to go, which then insert your joke on what technology is running the IRS or airlines or everything else, right? And so that's the hard part of like this, is that you almost have to keep this in the private sector, but yet the cost of keeping it in the private sector is going to start to increasingly just be so high that potentially there's going to be some other way that we're going to protect those organizations to keep on making sure they can offer these goods and services. Yeah,
and I think to that point, Lena Khan obviously right now is doing a lot in that trust busting space. I think there is a concern, a real concern, and valid or not, I don't know, but you have your own opinion on that. But where her thesis is effectively, it will end up getting these data aggregators. I mean, Google is effectively a data broker just to themselves, right? Like they take the data from the advertising side, they take it from your email side, and they just give it to themselves. They don't sell it, they just keep it. And they use it and they monetize it in other ways. Super smart. But I think her main concern is exactly that if we end up simplifying that ecosystem to a point that they have all the data, they don't sell any of that data, you're part of 1 or 2, 3, maybe tops providers. And there is no space for a marketplace. There is no competitive choice left for the consumer. So back to the point of, can you expect it as a consumer? I think the argument on yours relies on the idea that there's more than one option. So part of the reason I don't subscribe to the Google ecosystem personally is that I like the idea of my data staying with me, and I like the idea of privacy. And so I just don't use any of their products, which again has great cost to me in some ways, but I at least have a choice. In a world where it really collapses, maybe some of that choice gets eroded, and I don't know. I think then it becomes a different question for the government's role in that, but. Closing thoughts from you, Jason. Last words to you.
Well, before we close, I'll say the other thing you can do there, and I think is interesting that you see, is handling it from a obfuscation perspective, right? At the end user. And so you see this with your iPhone, like, hey, do you want me to make up an email address for you? Make up different things and just, have people stop providing that, and to customer, just providing the minimum you need. Like, I'm going to deliver this to this Amazon locker down the street, and so they'll never know who gets it. I think you may see a lot of those type solutions, and you may see some. I think companies really being privacy first. There's a lot of ExpressVPN. A lot of these other companies are coming out with that kind of like, let me just hide everything from the world for you. And so I do think that that is also, this is a big, complicated stew with lots of ingredients, and I think that's going to be one of them.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys for the conversation today. Fascinating non-AI, at least not this round. V2 will be the AI version
you
of this.
You snuck some AI in there. I know that's going to be the next thing. Well, now let's talk about AI tools in this space. So.
Exactly. Yeah, for those of you that would like to learn more, please visit the Insights page at critera.com. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us again. Bye-bye.